Alright, here we go. So, there's some wind. Hopefully it doesn't mess up the sound too much. This time I have headphones, so got a little speaker right here that I can, sorry, not a speaker, a microphone that I can speak into. Want to dive into trauma again. I've been having a lot of fun with trauma lately, talking to my partner about stuff like that. Trauma is a very interesting subject because I feel like a lot of people don't get it. And I'll say it this way. I would argue that people become traumatized because other people's trauma is projected onto them. Case in point. If someone cannot handle an emotion like anger, right, and that is being presented to them, and they leave, maybe it's not so much projections, but their response to that is likely going to be something along the lines of abandonment, right? And so they end up abandoning, right? And then there is some type of trauma that is had because abandonment was put in place, right? So the person that was abandoned is going to be traumatized because, oh, okay, I can't show myself in this manner. Healthy anger, right? And the reason why this is so interesting is because that person that becomes traumatized by the abandonment then ends up, of course, depending on how aware of their shit they are. Usually this stuff kind of happens earlier on in life. But depending on how aware they are of their shit, if they're not aware at all, they're going to end up being very traumatized. And it's going to end up being something that sticks with them for a long time. And not only that, but they're going to end up believing for a long time that there's something inherently wrong with them. And it's just really interesting because it's not true, right? One of the most interesting things that trauma does is that it blinds you from truly seeing yourself. It blinds you from seeing in fine detail you and also the other person and the other person's shit, and the differentiation between you and your shit and the other person and the other person's shit. So it's a very interesting kind of dynamic, right? When trauma happens, it usually happens because somebody doesn't understand something, right? So, like, say for instance, if I grew up with the belief that I was, if I grew up with the belief that I was a worthless piece of shit for whatever reason, and the very reason was because I presented myself with healthy anger, right, in a scenario that totally justified it, and the person that I was dealing with didn't like the healthy anger, or they couldn't handle it, right, and then they left, I'm going to learn a belief that there's something inherently wrong with me. Not only that, but I'm also going to I'm also going to form a nice guy complex, right? Because I learn that healthy anger is not an acceptable emotion to present. So then, down the line, as it goes on, I learn that... sorry for the wind. I don't know how noisy it is. But I learn a belief that I cannot present myself that way authentically, otherwise people will leave. So therefore, I learn to be a very nice guy. And when I say nice guy, I mean either non-existent or very loose boundaries. And that means that whenever somebody violates my boundaries, or if I don't even have any boundaries, let's look at the whole thing of somebody violating my boundaries, right? If somebody violates my boundaries, oh, wait a second, I'm not allowed to express healthy anger because that means that people will leave. So therefore, I abandon myself. I sacrifice myself. I like the word sacrifice because it's not just a matter of abandoning, it's a matter of sacrificing. You have this healthy boundary set in place of, okay, if you violate this or if you cross this, then this happens. And if it is crossed and you do not express the necessary and healthy anger required to feel what it is that you need to understand what the fuck actually happened, you're really going to screw yourself up, because you're going to teach yourself that people can walk all over you. They can treat you however the fuck they want to, and you don't do shit about it. So it's a very interesting thing. Trauma is a very interesting thing because it's often an illusion, right? It's often, okay, I was fed this belief about myself growing up based around, unworthiness, right? Because I presented myself this way and it was not acceptable. And the way that I discovered it was not acceptable was because there was abandonment involved. So therefore, that's clearly not acceptable. If you want people to not leave you and instead stay, what you need to do is abandon yourself. What you need to do is sacrifice yourself. So it's interesting because not only are we shown that we are worthy of being abandoned, but then we also learn to abandon ourselves. We also learn to sacrifice ourselves. And the really interesting thing about this, and we hear it all the time too, the really interesting thing about this is then when we hear people saying, I have sacrificed so much for you, it's like, yeah, I totally asked you to. I totally asked to be brought here into this life. Not that I'm not grateful for it, but it's like, it's very interesting, these manipulative ways of people. Yeah, again, trauma is a very interesting thing. The way that it kind of molds somebody. I would argue for a large majority of it, in terms of perception and perspective, it's a fucking illusion. Because if you go about your life after being abandoned, right, and that traumatizes you, and you learn that you can't be a certain way because if you do, you will be abandoned, you're going to live half a life because you're not going to be fully who you can be or who you are, right? If what's necessary is to display a healthy emotion, even if somebody can't handle it, and you discover that people are going to leave you if you do display that or if you do express yourself in that way, one of the worst things that you can learn is that other people's feelings of your emotions comes first. Now, I'm not here to talk about, it's necessary that it's okay or acceptable to just treat people like shit, but that's not what this is about. This is about somebody's capacity to display healthy emotions, and if those healthy emotions are not acceptable, it is not your fault. It is just that the person has a challenging time or an inability to handle those emotions. It has nothing to do with you. That's the thing when it comes to trauma. The reason why I would argue that trauma can be so confusing is because it oftentimes has nothing to do with the person who is being traumatized. Like, that's the highlight here. The reason why trauma is so confusing is because it often has nothing to do with the person who's being traumatized. Okay, you're going to be traumatized because I'm going to invalidate your healthy emotions. I'm going to leave you. You're going to be traumatized. It's going to fuck you up for decades, right? But it has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me. I just can't handle your shit. Okay? So, like, looking at that and seeing it clearly for what it is, it's fucking wild. It's really fucking wild. Trauma, when seen clearly, not your shit. I mean, you lived life a very certain way based on the trauma that you were raised with and the trauma that you were conditioned with, but that doesn't mean that it's your shit, or that it was your shit, right? Healthy emotions are fine. Anger is fine. There's nothing wrong with anger. If somebody violates a boundary, and we're very aware of boundaries when we're younger, right? When we're growing up, when we're in such a vulnerable state, the second we say no, right? That is a boundary being set. If that boundary is violated, and then of course consistently violated, we learn that our boundaries are not worth being respected. And if we continue to grow based on that, we're going to live very unhealthy lives in terms of how we approach relationship dynamics. It's just crazy. Trauma is so interesting. Not everyone experiences trauma the same way. Not everyone experiences the same trauma. What fucked this person up or that person up might fuck the other person up differently. It's very interesting. It's a very individual experience, and the way that it unfolds is just in fine detail. So, yeah, but the biggest thing that I'm trying to get at here is that trauma is confusing because the person who's becoming traumatized, it's not their shit. It's not their fucking problem. They're just getting confused. It's a veil of illusion, right? So, alright, you presented yourself this way, and I'm going to place this filter, this lens, this veil of illusion over your perception, and I'm going to distort it, and you're going to see yourself this way for a long time, right? And that's going to mold you into the way you are individually, how you work with relationships and their dynamics and all that stuff. That's all that it is. Trauma is very interesting. So, yeah, again, trauma is really just an illusion, right? Not to say that it's not real. Like, your experiences, your thoughts, and your feelings, and how you behave based on all that stuff is real. But that doesn't mean that it ever had anything to do with you. Again, if you're in infancy and somebody left you because you expressed healthy anger and they just couldn't handle it, that's their shit, not yours. Nothing wrong with you. But then, of course, you learn to go throughout life just being a nice guy and, people pleasing and all that stuff, and it screws you up because it teaches you that you can't ever get angry. Crazy.